All right, well, it is 2 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get this webinar started, and want to welcome everyone. My name is Matthew Reeves. I'm Director of Archaeology here at James Madison's Montpelier, and the webinar we're doing today is going to be covering work we're about to undertake on from funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities with the Collaborative Research Division. And we have a number of panelists that are going to be presenting on this project today. And we will go ahead and start with Dr. Elizabeth Chu, who's going to give an overview of the program. And before Elizabeth starts, just for housekeeping and for general information, if you want to pose questions, there's two ways to do it. You can either type it into the chat, and it's a running stream of commentary. There's also the questions and answers area that's a little more organized way to do it. We're going to be looking at both of these, but the other way is at the end of each of these person's segment, we're going to have about 5 minutes for questions, and we can either open up the mic or go to the question and answer bar. So we'll go ahead and get started. And so Elizabeth, I'm going to unmute you, and you can go ahead and get this rolling.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Elizabeth Chu, Executive Vice President and Chief Curator at James Madison's Montpelier. We're thrilled to have so many of you here today. I'm coming to you from my guest room / home office in Charlottesville, Virginia. This is a very uncertain and distressing time. So we really appreciate you all being with us this afternoon to hear about this very important and worthy project. And I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk about how this NEH funded archaeology project relates to our larger program of archaeology and interpretation at Montpelier as a whole. So those of you who have worked with us or know what we're about, know that we are committed to what we call whole truth history. And that means telling the whole story of the founding era, the stories of James Madison creating the Virginia plan that's the basis for the US Constitution up in the second floor library of the Madison's mansion, but also the stories of all of the enslaved people whose labor made his leisure time for reading and thinking possible, and whose unpaid labor created the profits that his family enjoyed for 3 generations living on the plantation. So after the 5-year restoration of the Montpelier House between 2003 and 2008, as those of you who know Montpelier will know, we began the work to excavate the area just south of the house where there were 3 slave dwellings and 2 smokehouses. This all was really brought into the forefront by comments from members of the descendant community towards the end of the house restoration project, when a group of descendants and Montpelier staff were standing out on the south terrace looking over the south yard, which at that point had nothing but a couple of outlines of buildings. And a member of the community commented, well, you spent $24 million on this house, and all my people got are dead grass and railroad ties. So that basically led to work, which led to our receiving a $10 million gift from the self-described patriotic philanthropist David Rubenstein that made the work in the South Yard possible. And we see that work as a very important step in returning slavery to the landscape of the Montpelier plantation. We have done the work in the South Yard. We've done the award-winning exhibition that it's a part of entitled The Mere Distinction of Color. And we have done much of our previous work, both archaeological and interpretive, on African-American history in partnership with members of the Montpelier descendant community, without whom the work we have done would not be nearly as truthful and as authentic as it is. And so we are really excited to be taking what I see as the next step in that project to try to fully suggest to our modern day visitors that Montpelier was a working plantation where people that the Madisons held in slavery labored both in the main house, in the fields, in the workshops, and elsewhere to make the plantation profitable to sustain the Madison family. So embarking on the new project at the overseer site, which in itself is a critical sort of part of the machinery that kept slavery in place, as you all know, and which is almost never discussed or talked about at plantation sites that do interpret slavery. So we'll be filling in a big gap in our interpretation with the work on the overseer's site. And then we see that as the first step in the unlocking and understanding the entire farm complex is located just below the present day site of the visitor center. So this site is, this work, this NEH funded project is the natural progression of our work at Montpelier. And I'm very happy to hand this back over to my colleagues who will take it from here to fill in the details of the work that we're going to be doing.
All right, thank you, Elizabeth. So the purpose of this webinar is to give an overview. Elizabeth Dr. Chu gave a wonderful introduction for this, putting it into a broader context of the museum. What the goal of this webinar is to not only introduce you, the folks out there listening, to what this project is, but also to give you all the opportunity to understand what our methods are, what how we're going to be publicizing the information, what we'll do with the project in the end with the archaeology, not only in terms of writing reports and articles, but also how we interpret this to the public. And this is actually mandated by law. That by receiving this grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, from the what this allows us to do is do archaeology, but in the process of doing archaeology, we are in essence destroying a site, even though we're doing it very carefully and scientifically. And under Section 106, which is part of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, any project that uses federal money to impact a site that's eligible for the National Register is required to go through a process where we work with consulting parties. And the consulting parties that we're working with here at Montpelier include a number of Indian tribes that are in the area. We also are working with the Orange County Historical Society as a consulting party, and then also with the Orange County African American Historical Society and the Montpelier Descendants Committee, which is made up of descendants of individuals who were enslaved at Montpelier. So what I wanted to present next is to talk about where we're coming from in regards to what the background for this project is, like how we are engaging the public in this process. And normally what you think of with archaeologists and engaging with the public is doing a site tour, having an article in the local newspaper. And what we've done is really tried to take that up to the next notch in terms of being a historic property, where we actually bring the public in and various interested constituencies to take part in the research, to take part in the excavation, to take part in the lab work, to take part in how we're going to be interpreting the sites at the home farm complex and in the overseer's site. And where a lot of the background for this comes from is from work that we did as part of the project that Elizabeth referred to, which is in the South Yard. And I'm going to share my screen now and start a PowerPoint. So bear with me here for a minute and hit F5. And hopefully switch screens. Okay, hopefully everybody can see this. The Montpelier site, as everyone knows, is the home, the family home of James Madison. And in many ways, before we started in the work on the South Yard, and what I'm going to be presenting here is basically about a 12-year history of the project of the South Yard. And then I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Terry Brock, who's going to be going to the specifics of the home farm and the overseer's site that we're going to be working on for the next 3 years. But when we started the work on the South Yard, and the South Yard, if you can see my laser pointer here, is the area which where it gets its name, is the area south of the main house, that is where the enslaved domestics both lived and worked. And before 2007, when we were just at the tail end of restoring the house, basically what was represented at Montpelier visually was the main house. And what was not represented was the over 300 individuals who lived and worked at Montpelier during Madison's lifetime. And in many ways, not representing any of those individuals was akin to only representing the 2,700 acres that you can see right here with simply the main house. And what we began doing in 2007 was to look towards making a more concerted effort to do this. And this comes right from what Elizabeth was talking about. The place where that conversation that Elizabeth referred to, where one of the members of the descendant community noted that, you know, you've done this $24 million restoration of the main house, and how you're representing our families' lives and their homes is with dead grass and railroad ties, happened right where you see it right here on this deck. And where that came from is after touring the house, and this is the event that this happened at was our second descendant reunion that we held. The first one was in 2001, the second one was in 2007. And when we brought descendants out on the deck, what we showed them was, you know, we'd just gone through the main house, showed them what we were doing there, showed them the archaeological discoveries we had made in the South Yard. And we pointed out that the kitchen was all these buildings were located by an insurance map from 1837, where there were 5 structures noted in this area on that insurance map. And through archaeology, we had located an additional structure, a kitchen, that was outlined by this brick foundation. One of the quarters we outlined with what appeared to be railroad ties, and then the smokehouses were outlined with basically dead grass, and the other quarters were basically represented by these large DuPont champion trees from the early 20th century. And this is where a number of individuals stated, you know, how is this dead grass and railroad ties a way to represent our ancestors' homes? And we really took that to heart, and that became a call to action for us. And what we did in response to that was begin the process of rectifying this landscape. And the first step was building timber frame representations of these buildings so that people would know, visitors would no longer ask questions about the grass and the trees, but they would ask, what are these buildings out there? Are those the homes of the individuals that were enslaved by Madison and worked for him? And then we could start that conversation. What we also did was we applied to the National Endowment for the Humanities for a grant to do excavations on 3 different sites across the property where we knew from archaeological survey we had found evidence of slave quarters. And those 3 sites are shown on this map right here. You can see the visitor center right here, the main house is here. Where the South Yard is located, the mansion grounds, That's where we did extensive excavations and found evidence for 2 duplexes. That was done in 2011. We also did an excavation in an area where surveys revealed a carriage house and a stable. And there was also a slave quarter there that was a log structure that we refer to as Granny Millie's home. We believe that was her home based on documentary and archaeological evidence. And then finally, we did excavations in the home farm area where we had found evidence for slave quarters where the enslaved field workers were living and working. And these buildings were, basically outside of the mansion grounds were these log structures. Now, in the process of doing this work, we did this slave quarter archaeological project looking at the homes of the enslaved community from about 2010 to 2013, and it generated quite a bit of interest. And what we really started in earnest at that time were our expedition programs where people could come out for the week and join in the archaeology, and not just in terms of excavating at sites, but also learning about artifacts, learning the methods that we use, the interpretations, the lab techniques we use for analyzing these sites. And it really started us getting into, conversations with our staff and the participants about how to really get people engaged in archaeology, but more importantly, get the public engaged with the kind of research we were doing on the enslaved community and how that tied into the larger story with Montpelier, with the Constitution, slavery, and race. And with the work we did during that time period, we ended up with locating just exceptional preserved deposits that gave enough information on these homes that we felt very confident they could be restored. And to restore, we needed to, of course, get grants to do this. And when about the time that Kat Emhoff started at Montpelier in 2013, she requested that we move forward in looking at what the next steps would be on the landscape. And so with consulting with Christy Coleman and Dr. Michael Blakey, we organized a Descendant Landscape Congress in 2014 and posed this question to the descendant community. We asked them, showed them, it was basically two days of tours and discussions about what we had found, where we were in the research, and asked them, what is the next step? And we wanted to just open up the floor for answers and not put anything, not lead with anything in this discussion. And almost unanimously, what the descendant community came up with is the next work we really needed to do was at the main house. Right now, at that point in 2014 with the main house, it was very well represented in terms of being Madison's home and a place where enslaved individuals worked. But the enslaved homes were being only represented by timber frames did not have the same cachet with visitors and the same impact that restored buildings would have. And so what we put together was, a way to message this. And really fortuitously, we couldn't have planned this better. Less than 3 months later, David Rubenstein visited the property. And one of the first things he noticed was these timber frame buildings in the South Yard. When we talked about how the descendant community was very interested in having their ancestors' homes represented, that really struck a chord with him. And so what he donated was money to make this happen. And so beginning in 2015, we began the process of restoring the 6 buildings in the South Yard. And where we began for the restoration was the duplexes, because we had done the archaeology there. So by the first buildings we reconstructed were these duplex structures, and the archaeology that we started was in the area of the smokehouses, and then basically progressed to the main house with this additional slave quarter and the kitchen. But for the smokehouses were obviously work structures. They weren't habitations, but all around these smokehouses, being in this low area, was just massive concentrations of broken ceramics, glass, animal bone from the enslaved families that were living in the South Yard. And one of the following that Descendant Landscape Congress in 2014, we engaged with the descendant community on coming out on our expedition programs that by that time we had been running for about 4 or 5 years and really begun to find a workflow with getting the public involved in this. And it really worked out wonderfully because during that program, with so many artifacts coming out of the ground and so much to talk about, and being at the beginning of this restoration process and interpretive process in the South Yard, we really began to, what came from that week-long excavation with the descendants were all kinds of questions and stories and really the needs that the descendant community saw that Montpelier needed to act on to present their ancestors in a compelling way. And so included in this workshop was an afternoon discussion of what the next steps would be. And what descendants said, or the participants in this mirrored what the Descendant Landscape Congress stated, was that, you know, we really needed to make Montpelier a more inclusive community, meaning that we needed to have more African Americans as staff members and also as interns, you know, or as students, whatever we needed to do to make that process happen. And that's something we took to heart at that time, and we still do today. We offer scholarships for African Americans who want to come on field schools or expeditions. And with the field schools, we have a internship to staff tracking, career tracking path where individual students can become staff members in the archaeology department. In addition, what these discussions brought about were the need to really bring, you know, more community members on these programs. And in 2017, we started doing 2-day programs with the community, which allowed us to do additional programs. And at this time, we were just, you know, we're in the throes of restoring the South Yard, and we were just beginning to develop the ideas for the exhibits that would accompany this space. And what that exhibit would eventually become is what is today the Mirror Distinction of Color. And it's not only in the restored spaces of the South Yard, the buildings, but also in the cellar. And with the descendant community already as a committee in that we could interact and collaborate with, we had the descendant community working with us from the get-go with this new exhibit. And what we developed with the descendant community was messages and themes that allowed the intersection between slavery, the Constitution, and race to be explored with the voices of the descendants. And so in engaging the descendant community, we didn't do this at the end of the exhibit and, you know, allow them to see the exhibit. We did it from the beginning. In the brainstorming sessions, descendants were involved in this process. In the vetting of the proofs of, you know, color schemes, descendants were involved in this process. And what it ended up producing was essentially a crowdsourced exhibit that really that in many ways has meaning for all Americans. And it's something that has really made us think not only about the exhibit, but also about how we do the business of interpreting a presidential home where slavery and enslaved individuals were vastly the most important part of this scheme. And by the end of 2018, when we had much of these spaces restored, the exhibit was opened, we started planning for another program, which was entitled Engaging Descendant Communities. And this was a 2-day national summit on working with other historic properties that were interpreting slavery at their home institutions. And so there were about 15 sites that came to this event. And these various institutions not only brought their representatives, but also their members of their descendant community. And what we came up with was a rubric for how to engage descendant communities on these historic homes and properties. And really what the end objective of this rubric was one that allowed the institution to have steady progress in the collaboration between descendants and the infrastructure of the institution, not only in terms of the interpretation, but the research, but then also in the governance of that institution with the board and staff. And so this is, all of these we've built on in the work we've done in the South Yard, and we're essentially taking from the get-go in the project we're doing at the home farm and the overseer's site. And one of I'd say the main contributions we've gotten from this is very much a very strong relationship with the descendant community. And I'm gonna go ahead and stop screen sharing here and go back to my face. But the relationship we have with our descendant community today is one that's guided by a model that Dr. Michael Blakey developed in his work at the African Burial Ground in New York City, which is the clientage model, where the ethical client for a project is the group that has a vested interest in it. In this case, it is the descendant community, and we define the descendant community very broadly. And today, the Montpelier descendant community is its own separate entity from the Montpelier Foundation. It is the Montpelier Descendant Committee. And we work with various subcommittees of the descendant community on all the work that we're doing. And with the NEH project that we're engaged with, we are from the get-go are starting with the community as not only a consulting party for this NEH project, but then also there are two community members who in their own professional background, Dr. Iris Ford and Dr. Michael Blakey, are consultants on the project for what we're doing with our methods and approaches with the community and with archaeology. So with all this as a background, what we want to do with this session, and not just this session today, but for the future, is to create methods where we can periodically or ad hoc or whenever individuals want to check in on the progress. And this is through the web. This will be through webinars. Hopefully it'll also be in the next 3 or 4 months and live site visits, but we're not quite there yet. But when we'll get through this pandemic, we'll certainly return to that. And we're going to be Terry Brock has set up a web page for this project that he'll go into, and I'll send this out at the end of this webinar to all the participants. And also, what I'll send out to all the participants is the rubric for working with the descendant community. So at this point, let me see how we're doing for time. Yeah, we're right at 2:30, and so we've got a couple of minutes for if anyone has questions for this first phase. And it looks like Mary sent out some information already on the Zoom chat. So if anyone has any questions, we have a couple of minutes where we can practice these. If you want to raise your hand, you can actually speak, and that's if there's on the bottom of your screen in the middle, there's a hand there that you can click on, and then we can call on you to speak. Or if you don't want to hear your voice over the broad internet, which I don't blame you, I'm terrified to be doing this myself, you can go to the question and answer or go to the Zoom chat. There's several methods to engage us. So, and I must say, one of the things that we've been trying to do with our lectures and our tours is do what's called a dialogical approach. This is something that has come from the work we did with the Summit on Engaging Descendants. And that is a method where instead of just giving a monologue like I just gave, we actually meet people where they're at. And this really came from opening an exhibit like Mere Distinction of Color, where we're dealing with the difficult subjects of race, slavery, and the Constitution. And not everybody comes to Montpelier expecting to engage with these topics. And so what we found, both interpreters, our staff archaeologists, everyone at Montpelier is trying to meet people where they're at. And this is, again, we're taking all these lessons into account with the project. And it looks like we've got one question here. Sarah Hoffman, I'm gonna allow you to talk.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm Paul, Sarah's husband.
Hi,
but
Paul.
my question is two-part question. How did you find the descendant community? And then once you found them, how receptive were they to participating? Were there a lot that were like, no, I don't want to be part of that? And, just speak to that.
I'm going to go ahead and mute you, Paul, because I hear the dogs. But that's a really good question. What that process was one where initially we didn't have much success in 2010. We began writing to members of the community about coming out and doing archaeology, and had a few responses. But it wasn't until we engaged with a family that was having a descendant family that was having a reunion here at Montpelier that we found a way to network with that family and bring in a larger group. And that was in 2015. And as part of that process, one of the things we posed to that week-long expedition, and as many of y'all know who are archaeologists, when you work at a site, everybody gets real familiar with each other, and those barriers break down in a couple of hours being out in the sun. And one thing we asked folks was, what were we doing that made archaeology at a plantation so unattractive? And a good friend of mine, who's become a good friend since then, Leontini Clay Peck, said, Matt, when you first told me, I could come and dig at a plantation for free, what immediately came to mind was, well, we Black folk know about that. That happened to us for 200 years and it didn't work out too well. And so you need to change your language. And what she suggested was talking about, what would be important for descendants of the African diaspora, which is the ability to have contact with your ancestors. And she said what really blew her away was to be able to hold an artifact in your hand and know that the last person to touch that artifact was potentially one of your ancestors or someone that knew your ancestor. That, she said, was as powerful as going back, visiting the motherland to find your roots. And so when we began engaging with the community, in meeting the community where they were at, that's where we really started to have success in terms of interaction, and that's where the conversations just really started to roll.
Matt, I think another important thing to note is that the definition of descendant that we all operate under is very broad. So while there are families who we know are directly tied to people who were enslaved by James Madison on the property, it's really about who has a connection to this space and who finds this space meaningful. People, African Americans who are local, are connected. If they have ancestors that lived in Orange or Madison, they're probably connected in some way to this community. So there has not been a lot of rules, for lack of a better word, about who gets to be part of this community and who doesn't. And so I think that's really also made it a very large community and has allowed for a lot of really amazing discussion and connections, and has allowed it to be a really vibrant partnership, which I think has been really important.
Yeah, thank you, Terry. And I'm typing an answer to one question here about how long archaeology has been happening. No, thank you, Terry, for elucidating on that definition of community. That's something that really helped us with the process. And one individual is asking, what is the model called again that you mentioned that Dr. Blakey is proposed? And that is, what that's called is the clientage model. And that is where there are three parties. There is in the case of Montpelier, it would be the Montpelier as a group, the archaeology department in Montpelier is doing the work. There would be the descendant community who would be the ethical client, and then there would be the professional community. And these three interact to check on one another. And I will send to all the attendees the article that Dr. Blakey wrote on this process, because he will be able to describe it in much more eloquently than I can. But it's the basis for the work that we're doing next that Dr. Brock is going to be describing. And at this point, Terry.
Wait, Matt, you've got another question that you missed.
Yeah, what's that, Mary?
It's another one in the chat from Kim McQuillan. She says, is there some place where we can learn about specific discoveries made during excavations? This is my first time hearing about Granny Millie. I teach 6th grade and my students connect with artifacts even more when they know the stories behind them.
Absolutely. We've recently set up a website called the Digital Doorway. And so if you do a search on Digital Doorway, that links you to all sorts of information on the documentary research, the archaeology. And if you email any of us, we can send you more information on Granny Millie's cabin, and actually even videos where we're talking about that.
You have another question?
Sorry, Kim, we also offer a week-long program every year that is a excavation program specifically designed for teachers. So it's an opportunity for you to come to Montpelier, live on the property for a week. You spend the first part of the day working in the field with our staff, and then the afternoon we work with another nonprofit organization called Archaeology in the Community that focuses specifically on K-12 education and archaeology. And so Dr. Jones, the CEO of that organization, takes the afternoon to teach you about how to take what you've learned in the field doing hands-on learning and apply it to the classroom. So that's a really great opportunity. There's partial scholarships available for that as well. We're really hoping it's going to happen this year, but obviously everything is up in the air. So, but that's another opportunity to actually come to Montpelier and get that experience also.
And if you go to our website, www.montpelier.org/dig, that has a complete listing of all the programs that we hope to begin in late summer, and that'll be evolving as we move forward. But we are planning on having public programs as part of the project that Dr. Brock is going to be describing next. So all of you who are listening can come and dig with us, which we would love to carry on this conversation live at the Overseers site. So with that, Terry, why don't you go ahead and take it away, and I'll look at the questions and compile them afterwards as well.
I was going to say, the next question will go right into what Terry talks about. So we have a question from Leon Snate asking do we have any descendants who identify with the families of the overseer?
I wasn't, currently we don't, but hopefully we will.
We don't currently, but we very much hope to before the end of the project.
Yeah, so if anyone out there knows of any descendants of overseers in Orange County, I mean, we're like Terry mentioned about the descendant community, we're casting the net very broadly because these, as Terry will talk about, is these folks are very itinerant, and it's a very little known topic, but I won't say any more because this is going into what Terry's talking about.
Awesome. All right. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Terry Brock. I'm Assistant Director for Archaeology. I lead all the field excavations at Montpelier. I wanted to start first just by thanking the NEH for supporting the project. That's really, really important. And what that actually means is that I'm thanking all of you who are listening, because the NEH is supported by citizens and taxpayers. So, it's really important to, I think, acknowledge that the support we're getting to do this research project is actually coming from all of you. So thank you. I'm going to go ahead and show you some pictures and more words than I typically like to do, but it is what it is. Hold on. All right, can you all see this? There we go. That's what I want you to see. All right. So today I want to talk a little bit about the research project that we proposed and that was accepted by the NEH. Specifically, I'm going to give a little bit of background on the proposed study area, the place that we're actually going to be impacting. Some background on the very little that we know about overseers, both both as far as what we know about overseers in general and about what we know about the overseers at Montpelier. I'm going to talk about the research questions that we're going to be investigating and the methodology that we're going to tackle in order to address those questions. And then Dr. Minkoff, our curator, is going to follow up and talk about some of the specific artifacts and things like that. So first, the study area. So the study area is located within the main visitor core, just to the south of Montpelier Visitor Center, for those of you who know the property. So that's, can you see my mouse? Can Mary or Matt, thank you. So the visitor center is right here. So everything that's outlined in blue is the area that we're really interested in examining. This area is called the home farm. And we have done some previous excavations in this area up here and down here, which I think Matt mentioned a little bit. And I was actually through a previous NEH collaborative research grant. And these initial excavations identified slave quarters and agricultural buildings, indicating to us that this area really is not an open green field like it looks like currently if you visit it, but is actually a major agricultural complex on the property. We also have some historical documentation, maps in particular, that indicate this reality as well. So this is really, when it comes to thinking about what's a great place for us to really understand the lives of overseers and the entire agricultural system that's going on in the early 19th century. At Montpelier in Virginia, this is a perfect study area, perfect place for us to start asking those kinds of research questions. This begs the question, of course, who is the overseer? So in general, overseers were a critical part of managing plantations during slavery. Large plantations often had multi-tiered management structures, so with a primary overseer or bookkeeper who is overseeing additional overseers or drivers who manage different parts of the property. There are plenty of misconceptions out there about overseers. They're often discussed as being uneducated, poor, always being white, always being free, or that they are drunk or just really kind of scum of the earth. When in reality, most overseers actually occupied a middling status, and many were literate. If you think about it, really the primary overseers, the people who are near the top of that management hierarchy, are responsible for managing most of this plantation. Remember, James Madison was gone at Montpelier from 1801 until 1817, right? He was spending a lot of time in Washington, DC, being a president. So someone was at home managing this plantation, right? Also, there's plenty of overseers who were African Americans as well. So what the historical research does agree on, that other folks have done, is that overseers often occupied a very complex position as a man in the middle, caught in between their employer with the task of motivating laborers who were enslaved, and those people also were very tangibly actually had higher value to their employers than the overseer did. So they're in this very sort of complicated, strange social and economic position on any plantation. What's often left out of the historical narrative and left out of a lot of the archaeological work that has happened, which in both cases is pretty minimal as far as understanding the lives of overseers, is just how the overseer and their families dealt with being in that position in the middle. What types of choices were they making to embrace or resist, to navigate, redefine, or avoid the position that was placed upon them by their occupation? In large part, the overarching question that our research is curious about is, how did the institution of slavery impact the daily lives and the choices that overseers had to make at Montpelier? From a research perspective, we've kind of asked this question before, but about the lives of enslaved African Americans at Montpelier. So our hope is that this research will help expand on our understanding of how the institution of slavery impacted everyone, while also expanding on our understanding of the entire plantation system at Montpelier. At Montpelier, we have very minimal documentation that we've uncovered so far about overseers. It's evident that there was likely more than one operating at the same time. We believe the site we are investigating was home to one of the many one of the primary overseers. Madison seemed to have one overseer at any one time who seemed to really be running the show. Early in the 19th century, there was a man named Gideon Gooch, who was later preceded by a man named Abram Eddins. We also know that there were other overseers on the property, likely working in outlying farms, and that some of those individuals were enslaved. Sawney being the best example. He's one of the best known because he shows up so often in the documents and actually has a tract of land that is called Sawney's Tract. So, so we also know exactly where Sawney probably would have been living, and that's not where this current house is located. So this research project will help us to begin to understand even more about the lives of these people and their families, where they were before and after their time at Montpelier, what their tasks and responsibilities were, and so much more. We are very much at the stage with the research where we have a whole lot more questions than we do answers. So speaking of which, I want to get into the actual research questions. These are the questions we're going to be asking largely of the archaeological research. So the research is interested in both how the overseer was perceived and how other groups tried to shape their identity, and then how the overseers and their families acted within this context and attempted to build their own social identities. Archaeology is really well suited for this type of investigation because the way that human beings interact with their physical spaces and their objects often reflect the identities that they're trying to build. So we have two research questions that examine how the Madisons and the enslaved community perceived and manipulated the overseer's position in the plantation hierarchy, which is really necessary to understanding the context within which the overseer and his family lived and worked. So the first question is, how does the architecture of the overseer house reflect the Madisons' understanding of the place of the overseer in the plantation hierarchy? So this is really looking at the quality of the structure, the materials used, so on and so forth, and comparing those buildings to other structures that are on the property to see kind of where you would expect them to, where they're kind of fitting within that hierarchical structure. And the second question is, how is the role and place of the overseer reflected in the position and alignment of the overseer's house on the overall landscape? So really looking at the entire home farm complex and where is the overseer's house placed on that landscape in relationship to all the other buildings, the agricultural buildings, the homes of the enslaved African-American community, even the Madison Family Cemetery, which is right next door. I'm really trying to get an idea as to how what these relationships and how these buildings are related to each other matters. So these questions, in order to answer these two questions, right, actually require us to first understand what the overseer house looked like architecturally, which is very hard to do because you can't see it above ground, right? So we have to do excavations to do that, and then compare it to other domestic structures. And then second, it requires us to examine the entire home farm to understand how that home is placed in relationship to the other work buildings and slave dwellings. And of course, that means we have to find those buildings too, right? So there's a lot of archaeology that needs to be done when you develop methodologies that are going to help us answer those two questions. The second question has to do to our two next research questions, really examine the choices that the overseers are making within, and that their families are making, right, within the context of the landscape and the house and the space that they're working and living. So these questions, the first one is, what consumer choices are the overseer and his family making, and how do these choices reflect their social identity? So what kind of ceramics are they buying? What kinds of jewelry are they wearing, or cufflinks do they have? Really looking at those artifacts in detail to try to get an idea as to what type of choices these folks were making and how they were reflecting who they were through the objects that they were purchasing. And then the second question is, what choices are the overseer and his family making, and how they organize their household and their yard space, and how do these choices reflect their social identity? So this is still looking at artifact types, but really looking at how are they distributed amongst the yard space, or how are they positioning their outbuildings in relationship to other elements, or where are their porches on which side of the house, and what do those face? Where are they doing work-related activities versus social activities, and how does that relate to the broader landscape that they're working within? So to answer these questions, once again, we need to carry out in-depth excavations at the overseer house so that we can examine these different types, so we can recover these objects, and so that we can do analysis and research on them, both in terms of looking at each object individually, and then also looking at them in larger distribution patterns. So for those of you who followed our work so far and looked at the work that we've done on homes of enslaved laborers, and even the work we've done at the Madison home, you'll kind of get these are not different questions actually than we've been asking before. We're examining asking the same types of questions. How are people surviving and living within the institution of slavery, and how is that impacting the choices they're making? What kinds of things are they purchasing, right? We often talk about members of the enslaved African American community. The archaeology has demonstrated that they had access to local markets and were making purchases and making specific selections about the type of ceramic designs and so on and so forth, to decorate their homes, which tells you things about who they are and what they do. So next up is methodology. So in order to answer these questions, we have to cover two different areas, right? We have to examine the home farm landscape and the overseer house. So sites at the home farm will be investigated through a variety of survey methods intended to gather enough information to establish location, function, and hopefully some architectural clues about the buildings that made up the home farm. So this is a multi-step process that includes a whole lot of different survey methods. These include using LIDAR, historical documents, 20-meter metal detector survey as means of really identifying what we call site components. And then taking those site components and zeroing in on those by doing 10-foot metal detector survey, shovel test pit survey, and geophysical survey, primarily ground penetrating radar. And then once we get there, we need to move in and do 5 by 5 foot test units just to get us a bit of a glimpse. So for this project so far in the home farm survey, the first 3 components have been completed. So we've done LIDAR and we've done 20-meter survey, and that basically identified these site components. So this is a map of the 20-meter survey here, and these are the different site components that have been identified based on that map. The rest of the methods we haven't done yet. The rest of the things are still things we have yet to do. And we're going to be spending the next 3 years of this project completing these elements. So that's really identifying the sites within the different components. So that includes the 10-foot metal detector survey, shovel test pits, and geophysical survey, and then doing targeted excavations. That'll be the 3rd year we'll be focused on that. At the overseer's house, we've done a whole bunch of this work already. We know exactly where the site is. So we have this wonderful 1844 plat that shows the general location of the overseer's house. That's this sketch here, and it says overseer's house, which is a good clue. So we've georeferenced this map, and it takes us to this location here, which corresponds really well with the 20-meter survey. We've done 10-foot gridded survey. So on this map down here, you can see the 20-meter survey, and this is the 10-foot, and you can see that we've got a really nice highlight of where you see red and orange means lots of hits. So this has taken this large area, and we're starting to zero in on a smaller location. We've also done ground penetrating radar and stuff like that, so we're able to zero in. This is all work that we've done before we've received the NEH funding, which is important to note. And that includes also some 5 by 5 foot test units that we've conducted that show evidence of 19th century architecture. There's brick rubble out there, cut nails, things like that, that are really give us a clue that we do have, there's a building in there somewhere. What we have left to do is to actually excavate the site and really focus in on identifying the location of the building, and then doing artifact analyses and things like that. It's worth noting also, all of this stuff is going to go into GIS. We're also working on using GIS, geographic information systems, as a tool for really doing a lot of this site-wide and study area-wide analysis. So that's going to be really important for helping us kind of understand how all of these things relate. Otherwise, the next step is going to be looking at artifacts, which is what Mary is going to talk about, is the artifact processing. So if I don't know if Matt, you want to do questions now, or all right, there's the same amount of panelists, same amount of attendees here than when I started, so that's great. Means nobody left.
That is a good sign. So why don't we go ahead and roll into Mary, and if we're monitoring the line for under the chat and under questions, and we can answer the questions live. So if you're ready, Mary, we'll go ahead and go right into you. I'll unmute you.
All right. Well, I'm excited to be here today and show you a little bit about what we have started to find in the process of looking for the overseer's house. So I have a few of the artifacts that we uncovered during the late summer and into the fall through those excavations that Terry just sort of wrapped up talking about, those 5 foot by 5 foot units. And one of the things that's been really interesting about this place is because the area has been plowed, the artifacts that we've been recovering are really tiny. But these tiny artifacts actually can have a really big impact on our understanding of people's lives in the past and what the overseers owned, and to try to sort of answer some of those questions that Terry proposed. So I picked out some ones that I thought were really interesting, some that are starting to give us some clues, but also ones that are kind of leading us to more questions than answers. So for those of you who know me, you know that I'm always going to start with ceramics because they're my favorite and they get me really excited. And I'm actually going to kind of hold them up to the camera and then flip-flop to share some screens. But one of the most exciting sort of discoveries came from this little guy right here. So this is a fragment of a transfer printed whiteware. It has sort of a purple color to it, and it's in a pattern called Tea Time. And I'm going to share my screen with you also. You can kind of see what that looks like as a whole vessel. So if you see what I'm showing you right here, this is actually a page off of our PowerPoint that we use to help us identify ceramics. So we had found quite a few of ceramics in this pattern before, but it wasn't until it was discovered at the overseer's house area that we actually were able to figure out what the name of the pattern was and some extra information about it and what it would look like as a whole vessel. So if we look at this, what you can see is a woman in the center. She's dressed in sort of 19th century garb. She's having tea by herself. She's surrounded by all of these flowers. And the majority of the pieces we had found had just been part of this border here. So it wasn't until we found that piece that I showed you featuring the woman's face herself that we were actually able to identify the pattern. Unfortunately, there's not a lot known about this pattern. We can date it to about the 1830s based off the color and the fact that it's whiteware, so the material type. But the name Tea Time is just one that's been dubbed to it by members of the Transferware Collectors Club. It's an unknown maker. There's no maker's mark. So we really don't have a tighter date range on it just yet. But why it's interesting to me is that previously, before discovering it at the overseer's house, we had only ever found fragments of it at the field slave quarters. So that leads us to a lot of questions. Why do the overseers and the members of the enslaved community have the same ceramics? And that's a kind of a question we've been wrestling with a lot, of trying to figure out the relationship between the ceramics that the Madisons own and the members of the enslaved community. So one of the first things that we did when we discovered this piece is we started asking the expedition participants who had helped us find these fragments, well, what did they think? So one thing that we talked about are the vessel forms itself. So here's another fragment of that tea time, and it's a saucer fragment. There's a little bit of a foot ring right here and the shape of it. What we had recovered from the field quarters was actually a tea bowl or a tea cup. So we have two different vessels for sure, but definitely the same pattern and likely of the same set. What we know about teawares is full sets could be bought together, or cups and saucers could be purchased separately. So maybe the overseers and the members of the enslaved community were simply going to the same store, picking out the same stuff and buying it because that's what was available in their price range. Maybe the overseer had the complete set and somehow either lended, gave, or passed down a piece to a member of the enslaved community. Maybe a member of the enslaved community had the whole set and it was taken by the overseer. So we hope by doing further excavations, trying to find who has more pieces, more vessels, what's showing up, is an anomaly on one site versus the other, those kinds of questions can be answered. We find a lot of these transfer printed patterns when we're doing archaeology, particularly when we were excavating in the South Yard. And we haven't found quite as many yet in the area of the overseers, but another sort of interesting pattern is this one. Now, it may not look like much to you, just kind of a black line across the base of a plate. But this is actually from a pattern called Rose Garden. And Rose Garden is also a whiteware. That version that we have here is in a black transfer print. We have found it in the South Yard in a blue transfer print. So same pattern, different colors. But what's really cool about Rose Garden is that the center design of the pattern makes it, is unique to each vessel form. So a dinner plate has a different center design than a soup plate that has a different design than a platter. So if we start to collect more pieces of that, we can not only tell the pattern, but we can tell the exact vessel form, so we know better about how it was being used. So it's really exciting to see something very similar to what we found in the South Yard, but different in color and possibly in form as well. And then of course, no archaeological site at Montpelier would be complete without finding some fragments of willow. So here's a fragment of a willow plate, but it looks really kind of gross. And that's because it's been burned. And some of the most interesting artifacts that have been coming out of the Overseer site have been pretty well burned. And that's giving us, again, another avenue of questions. Why were these artifacts burned? Were they in a building that burned? Did they get thrown in a fire? So that gives us lots of really interesting questions to ask. So something as common as willow that we find all across the property, probably owned by every single type of person that lived at this property, and every person that lived on this property is showing up. But again, there's something unique about it that's allowing us to answer and ask different questions. A few other artifacts that I wanted to show you all is some of our small finds. Like I mentioned, the small artifacts are really going to be kind of a clue for us. So this is one that I think is just really one of my favorite artifacts. This is a gun flint. So it's this lovely gray color, and it's so strong that it's really been able to keep its shape. So that lets us ask, again, all sorts of interesting questions. Who had access to firearms? Why were they having access to firearms? Was it control of people? Was it control of a pest population, maybe in the gardens, something along those lines? Was it for hunting? All of these different questions we can start to answer. I also am always very curious about what people were wearing. We found this lovely little cufflink. It has a clear or colorless paste gem set in a brass or copper alloy setting. And this just kind of gives us a little clue of maybe some of the finery that was being worn by people. No Montpelier site would be complete without at least one of these. And at the Overseer's excavations thus far, we have found fragments of 3 Madison wine bottle seals, this being one of them. Most of them are pretty chopped up like this. You may be used to seeing on our Instagram and our advertising the whole full circle that either says James Madison, J in the James for the president, or I as the J for his father. But the ones we're finding at Overseers have been broken quite a bit like this one. So this one, you just get the very bottom of M-A-D-I. So lets us know that it's Madison, but we don't know which Madison. We've also found quite a few of these. These are fragments of kaolin clay pipes. For those of you who have never seen a whole kaolin clay pipe, they look something like this. This is actually a replica pipe. I can barely even get it in the whole screen. It's so long. This is a replica pipe from Colonial Williamsburg that was actually donated to us by one of our volunteers, Karen Hayden. Thank you, Karen. But what we usually find are small 1 to 2 inch fragments of the stem and then fragments of the bowl. So we find quite a few of those. In that bag where this one was recovered, there was actually a smaller one recovered as well. So lots of pipe fragments letting us know that people are not only growing tobacco, but they are definitely consuming tobacco. Another sort of interesting find is this. One of my favorites, always an interesting thing, doesn't look like much at first, but so powerful, a slate pencil. And slate pencils are really especially interesting for us because this isn't what people took notes on a day-to-day basis. If you knew how to read and write, you're using a pen and paper. But a slate pencil is usually used by children that are learning to read and write. And this becomes a really important piece because one of the questions that we have is, was the overseer there by himself? Did he have his family with him? A wife, children? Were there enslaved people living as part of his household And were their children there as well? So that slave pencil can start to help us ask those questions about maybe those other people that are associated with the person who the house is named for, the overseer, but are part of this plantation and this community. So those are kind of a quick and dirty of some of the artifacts we find. I did want to show you, I did pull, just because everybody always has to look at a full plate. This is what a whole version of willow looks like. You can sort of see, this is a Davenport willow plate. This is on loan to us from our volunteer and visiting curator of ceramics, Leslie Boudery. So thank you, Leslie, for this. The willow fragments we have now, we can't necessarily identify with the maker just yet because they're so burned. I also wanted to show you again what that rose garden pattern looks like whole. So we'll go to this and then flip to the next one. So you can see this is the rose garden, that little black fragment. These blue fragments over here are from the South Yard. They're from a platter similar to this one. But in each one of these, there's this different design of roses taking up the center, which shows us the center of the plate. And then here, of course, is our willow. So with that, is there any questions for artifacts or things or anyone else?
I went ahead and just put it into gallery view, so we're all visible now. Team of panelists, in case anyone has any questions or anything.
Yeah, it looks like we have one question. I think it's from Mr. Hoffman. I think it was Paul or Peter. Paul, I've unmuted you, and you should be able to talk, Paul.
Hi, actually, this is Paul's wife, Sarah. I was the one that was
Hi,
walking in. Yeah, sorry, I was the one that was walking in that caused our dog to go absolutely crazy. I just had a quick question. What is the absolute coolest artifact you've ever been able to unearth there at Madison's home? We have our kiddos. Some of our kiddos are watching with us, and we were just curious. What is the coolest thing you've ever found?
Well, I'm going to go grab it out of the cabinet. So excuse me as I go get off screen.
We'll
they
talk
can
about
answer
ours
for themselves.
while you go with yours. Let's see. I'll go first, Matt. Unless you've got one.
Yeah.
So
go ahead, Terry, and I'll do mine.
So my favorite we found in the north dwelling at the in the South Yard building that was just recently reconstructed, and we found, and it's on display in the Mere Distinction of Color exhibition. But it's a pipe bowl, and one of the thing I really love about this pipe bowl is it has the profile of Lady Liberty on it, and that pipe bowl was found in a slave quarter. So this is a object that an enslaved African American would have been carrying around, smoking in a pipe, while being owned by the world's foremost authority on the concept of liberty, James Madison. I think we often lose track of it's very difficult in archaeology to see what people are thinking about, right? And to sort of address those kinds of things that are going on in people's minds. And it's very easy for us to talk about the ideas and concepts, political ideas and concepts that people like James Madison are having because they're writing them down and making constitutions and doing things like that. And this object really brings to light and shows that the same concepts and ideas that people like Madison are discussing and contemplating, African Americans who were enslaved on the property are also. And it also kind of highlights some of the hypocrisy or the sort of the disconnect that you often get when you visit Montpelier, and you have to kind of reconcile and wrestle with the fact that here was someone who was enslaved, who had this idea about liberty and was owned by someone who is this authority on this topic. So that object is absolutely one of my favorites. We got to find it twice because we found it one year, we found parts of it, and then the next year we found more of it. So that made it even better. and it all fit together. And now it's got a real special spot in the exhibition. So that's definitely one of my favorites, just because it ties these stories together so well.
So
Matt,
I have
you're
my
next.
favorite, and it also actually sort of helps answer Lucy's question. So Lucy on our chat says, have you ever found something that was unidentifiable and you didn't know what it was? Every single day that happens. And this was actually one of the things that we didn't know what it was when we first found it. So some of you may have seen this before, but what I'm holding up sort of suspended in this box is a ring, a finger ring made out of a stone called carnelian. And the material of it is that we didn't know for months. So I've been doing archaeology for 18 years. I had never seen this material before ever come out at an archaeological site. None of our staff had seen it. The only one who had ever seen it before the material was Matt, who had seen it doing archaeology when he found on one bead in Jamaica over 30 years ago, and he remembered it. And that's how special this material is. Carnelian comes primarily from either the Middle East or from India. And it's a stone. It's this beautiful sort of fiery orange and yellow stone. It was used primarily for making beads, some jewelry, but also for the stamps that people used for wax seals with their like initials on it. The stamp part was often made out of carnelian. Archaeologically, in the New World, in the Caribbean, in North America, it's incredibly rare to find. That trade network that traded that material across India went really heavily into East Africa, kind of across the Indian Ocean, but didn't really make it across the Atlantic Ocean into the Western Hemisphere. So when it is found on archaeological sites in the Western Hemisphere, it's almost exclusively found with people of African descent. And it's also almost exclusively found in burial sites. So usually in the form of beads. So it's incredibly rare. So we actually found it when we were looking, doing the archaeology of a building we call the South Kitchen. So this building had a really interesting life. It started its life as the starter home for James Madison's parents as they were building Montpelier. It kind of ended its life as a kitchen that served James's mother and also a slave quarter where an enslaved cook would have lived there while she worked to prepare the meals. So we find this artifact in that 19th century context. So when it's having the buildings living as a kitchen and quarter. And it's in this perfect condition, but it's so rare. So it took us months to identify what it was. And when we finally did, we put together, oh my gosh, it's carnelian. We think it's carnelian. Let's double check. So we sent it out to a specialist, a carnelian specialist, and had it microscopically analyzed to verify that yes, it is in fact carnelian, coming most likely from either India or Saudi Arabia. Once we got it back, we said, wow, how did it get here? So we looked at the other archaeological sites. This material almost exclusively found with African Americans. So we think, was this an artifact that came over with someone when they were taken from Africa and then passed down through the family? So we tried to think what examples of that might be in this area. And actually at Manassas, there was an ebony ring that was recovered in a kitchen that they've connected back to possibly somebody wearing that when they were taken from Africa and then losing it in a kitchen. And we have this sort of even practice today of every time anyone I know has ever lost a ring, it has been in the kitchen because they have taken it off to keep it safe while they're kneading dough or dealing with raw meat or washing dishes or whatever it is that they're doing, and then they've lost it. So we're starting to put together this story. And then one of the things we did that we always do is we talk to members of the descendant community. And one of the members of the descendant community who is descended from a woman who was enslaved at Montpelier, who is an enslaved cook, we started to tell her this story. We think we have this ring. We think it may have come over as somebody wearing it when they were taken from Africa and passed on through the family and then lost. And she said, oh my goodness, we have a story in my family of a red bead that was brought over and was passed down through the family. And that story was so similar to what we found, this sort of reddish colored ring that we kind of said, now we have hard scientific evidence with the microscopic analysis of the material. We have evidence from the descendant community through really strong, good oral histories. And then we have comparative archaeological evidence. So with all of that, we were able to say, this artifact, this ring is the one thing in our collection of over 3 million artifacts that we can really trace back to Africa. And that's why it's my favorite. And I really like telling the story, so I get really excited about it. Matt, do you want to talk about your favorite artifact, or do you want us to move on to the next questions?
Why don't we, I'll save my favorite artifact. I actually have it up on the screen, but there's a couple of other questions. And one is the tentative location of the overseer's house based primarily on metal detector or GPR surveys? And without a doubt, it's metal detector surveys. That has been the premier way for us to find these sort of sites. And we were able to locate nails with and other artifacts with it. And actually, this will just take 1 second. My favorite artifact, I can't help myself, is a, I'm going to share screens here, and my absolute favorite artifact is what's called a threshing tube.
That giant fish. Okay.
Yeah, the giant fish. That's my son's favorite one. But these threshing teeth we found at the home farm, and this was back in 2011, and it answers your question, Lucy, that Mary also answered. Have we ever found things we had no idea what it was? And we had no idea what these teeth were. We thought they were from a plow, and we were wondering if the site had been plowed. But when a friend of ours, Gordon Lohr, came to the site and saw these, he said, no, those are threshing teeth. And not only are they threshing teeth, but they're also hand forged because of the style of the nuts, and also the variety of shapes of the teeth. And what these are from are a threshing machine that would separate the chaff from the wheat kernels. And we found it, the particular site we found it at was one that was in a fixed threshing machine. But in metal detector surveys, we found these teeth in the middle of a field where there was probably a mobile threshing machine being used. And we know from documentary records that Madison writes to Jefferson in 1792 bragging about a new threshing machine. He has a mobile version and a fixed version. And so this gives us a clue as to, when we find one of these structures, is how it was being used. In the case of the threshing barn, it was most likely a granary and a barn that was put into a previously used tobacco barn and converted into a wheat threshing barn. So that's my favorite artifact. And what I also wanted to do is really go back to kind of the beginning of this panel, this webinar, and to really emphasize, the kind of dialogue we're doing right now. Is we want to get as much input from you, the participants, as possible. And this can take the form of, these kind of webinars, but also participation in programs, lectures that we can do, and also site visits. And if wanted to pose to people how they would see a beneficial way to intersect and interact with the projects that we've got planned for the next couple of years.
So Matt, we've got some more questions too coming through that we might want to kind of address before we get into that. So the first one is from Jim. He's asked, have we found any nails or glass pieces at the overseer's house? Absolutely. We found lots of nails. We have found quite a bit of glass. It has been pretty fragmented because of the plowing, but lots and lots of wine bottle glass in particular. And then a few very small but sort of exciting fragments of pharmaceutical glass, and maybe even some table glass, so like drinking glasses.
Mary, I'd like to sort of tack on to what Matt said also about metal detecting versus GPR. I think it's one of the things that maybe didn't come through in my presentation is that all the archaeological methods, we start kind of broad and they help us narrow down. And so metal detecting helped us get from here to here, and then from here to here. GPR is going to start to help us get from here to here. So, and the excavation testing that we're doing to find things like window glass and nails and brick is going to help us get from here to here. So they all help us learn different things at different scales. So just as far as like kind of how, that's kind of how the archaeological process works. So it's not so much which is better for, it's which is better for what, but at what scale. Obviously doing GPR of 75 acres is absurd and costing way too much money. But metal detecting, we can be really efficient with. So that's, just wanted to kind of clarify on that from a methodological standpoint.
The next
There's
question
one
we have
question
is
I'd
from
love to-
Brooklyn. She says, have you found any artifacts or any other evidence of the enslaved community retaining cultural or linguistic practices through the generations? Definitely cultural practices. We have found one really good example is we found quite a large, about this big quartz crystal that was intentionally placed in the corner pier of one of the double quarters in the South Yard, where kind of placing white, shiny objects, things like crystals, is something that we see often at enslaved sites throughout the Mid-Atlantic and into the Deep South that has connections with some West African spiritual practices. As for linguistics, I don't know, Matt.
To add on to that one, the quartz crystal, that's exactly, you picked the one I was exactly going to talk about, which is awesome. It's that one was pointed out to us at a in 2015 when we had the family reunion and about 15 descendants on the program. What so many participants, especially the elderly participants, noted was just what you said, Mary, the importance of white objects in the corners of a building to provide good luck or protection. And it could either be salt or crystal. And because of that, when we were, at that time, we were just getting ready to rebuild the duplex in the South Yard, the double quarter. We invited several of the participants back in 2015 in October to actually place a quartz crystal back in the reconstructed pier, just where Mary had described it in the archaeology. So like Mary said, that quartz crystal is on display in mere distinction, but we purchased a representative quartz crystal to put back into that building.
And there's some other sort of similar examples of things like that we find archaeologically here. The next question is, are there any plans for additional excavations at the original Madison home near the overseer's house, so at Mount Pleasant?
Yeah, for that, when we early on did a much broader survey of the original Madison home, and just to position where these two sites are, where the overseer's house site is about 20 yards from where the Madison's original home is, and then another 20 yards from the Madison Family Cemetery. We're finding an intersection between those two sites, this early to mid 18th century site and the early 19th century overseer's house site. And we don't have any immediate plans to go back to Mount Pleasant, the original home site, but we do have a lot of questions that we want to go back and answer of that site, especially about the main house, because with the excavations that Mary mentioned about the kitchen in the South Yard, turns out that is potentially the early planter's cottage where the Madison family, the second generation, moved in 1750, and it leads to questions about what was going on at Mount Pleasant at that time. But this grant that we are working on with NEH, we are not going to be pursuing those questions over the next 3 years. It's going to be focused on the early 19th century overseers and then the larger home farm.
I think that's all the questions we have in the chat. Okay.
Well, really appreciate everybody joining in for this webinar. We are planning on doing more of these webinars, and if anyone out there has ideas of what they'd like to see, especially the artifact handling sessions that Mary did, that's a lot of fun. And then also questions about the survey techniques that you had Terry talking about, or any of the history of projects that Elizabeth and I were talking about. We'd love to do more of that. And we're also going to be, as we move into the excavation season later on this summer, we're going to be engaging with everyone on social media, and also, looking for opportunities to share on our finds, publicly on our expedition programs. So one thing that if you're interested in coming out on a program, again, that's the www.montpelier.org/dig website. You can find the schedule for that. And then also with the digital doorway, we're going to be providing live updates on what we're doing at the site there and with our research in general. And Terry,
Instagram and Twitter, Montpelier_ARC, ARCH, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah. So, and Elizabeth, Mary, or Terry, do you all have anything else to add?
I don't think so. Just
No?
keep in touch, everyone.
And be safe.
Be safe.
We're thinking about everybody. It's good to see so many good friends here, and we look forward to seeing you more on Zoom, but even more so in person. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.